Mara had been at the sanctuary for exactly 4 hours when she was handed the task that no one else would take. The head keeper, a stocky woman named Gloria Hatch, pushed a worn paperback into Mara's hands without looking her in the eye. Gloria had a habit of doing that. She spoke to the floor, or the wall, or the middle distance, anywhere but the face of the person she was addressing. Mara had noticed this in the first 10 minutes of her arrival, and had filed it away without comment. "Far enclosure," Gloria said. "End of the row. You'll read aloud. 1 hour. Every evening." Mara looked at the paperback. It was a collection of old folk tales. The spine cracked from years of use. The cover faded to a soft gray. She turned it over. No author name she recognized. "Read to what?" she asked. Gloria finally looked at her. "Just briefly. You'll see." That was all she said. Mara had taken this job because it was the only one offered to her after the sanctuary in Halford closed without warning. She had packed her single bag, taken the bus north for 6 hours, and arrived at Silver Ridge with a reference letter and no expectations. She was not the kind of person who needed a place to feel beautiful or important. She needed work. She needed the kind of quiet that came from doing something useful. The Silver Ridge Royal Wolf Sanctuary sat at the eastern edge of pack territory, behind a long iron fence lined with old pine trees. It smelled of hay and cold earth, and something deeper beneath that, something animal and ancient, that Mara found oddly calming rather than alarming. There were 14 wolves in residence. She had been shown 11 of them during the afternoon walkthrough. 3 enclosures had been skipped without explanation. The far enclosure was the last one. She found it after dinner, when the other keepers had retreated to the staff quarters, and the grounds had gone quiet. The lantern above the gate was already lit. The gate itself was unlocked, which surprised her. Every other enclosure had a key code. She pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. The enclosure was larger than the others, with a high ceiling of wire mesh, open to the night sky, and a floor thick with clean hay. Against the far wall, almost entirely in shadow, lay a wolf. Mara had seen large wolves before. She had worked around them for 9 years. She thought she understood the scale of a full-grown male, but this one made every other wolf she had ever stood near seem like a memory of a wolf, a rough draft. He was enormous, silver-coated, with fur so pale it seemed to collect what little light existed in the enclosure and hold it rather than reflect it. His head rested on his front paws. His eyes were closed. He did not move when she entered. He did not twitch or lift his head or shift his weight. He simply lay there, deeply, impossibly still. Mara crossed the enclosure slowly and sat down on the hay a few feet from him. She studied him. His chest did not visibly rise or fall, but she told herself that was only the low light playing tricks. He was old. That much was obvious from the silver of his coat, the heaviness of his frame, the way his paws were folded with the careful slowness of great age. The sanctuary's records had listed him only as Lorne. No breed notes, no intake date. Just the name, and beneath it in red ink, "Do not enter after dark. Authorized personnel only." Mara had assumed she was authorized. No one had told her otherwise. She opened the book. She cleared her throat softly, the way she always did before speaking in a quiet space, and she began to read. The first story was about a fisherman who made a bargain with the tide. It was not a remarkable story. She had heard versions of it before, but she read it carefully, the way she did everything carefully. She did not perform the voices or dramatize the pauses. She simply read, steadily, as though the words themselves were company enough for both of them. Lorne did not move. She read a second story, then a third, somewhere in the fourth, a long, wandering tale about a woman who walked north until she found the place where the sky touched the ground. Mara's voice began to slow. Her eyes grew heavy at the edges. The hay beneath her was surprisingly soft. The enclosure was warmer than the night air outside it, and the lantern above the gate threw a steady, amber light that did not flicker. She told herself she would finish the paragraph, then the page, then the chapter. She was asleep before the chapter ended, the book still open across her chest, one hand resting in the hay a few inches from Lorne's enormous silver paw. She did not know how long she slept. She did not dream, or if she did not remember it when she woke. What woke her was not a sound. It was the particular quality of the silence, the way it shifted just slightly, the way silence sometimes does when something nearby has changed. She opened her eyes and found the enclosure unchanged. Lorne lay exactly as she had left him, still and pale and vast in the shadows. The lantern still burned. The night sky above the mesh ceiling was deep black, the stars very bright. She sat up slowly, found the book, closed it, and stood. Her knees ached from the ground, and her neck was stiff. She was embarrassed, distantly. She had fallen asleep on the job, on her first night, in an enclosure she had barely been authorized to enter. But there was no one watching. She was alone. She looked at Lorne for a long moment before she left. "I'll finish the story tomorrow," she said quietly, "if that's all right with you." He did not answer. She had not expected him to. She let herself out through the gate, relatched it carefully, and walked back to the staff quarters through the dark. The ground smelled of pine and cold air, and somewhere distant, wood smoke. She was tired in the deep, honest way she liked, the kind of tired that came from a full day, not from waste. She did not notice the figure standing at the tree line 50 yards away. She did not see the way he stood without moving, watching the gate she had just come through. She did not see his hands, still at his sides. She did not see the expression on his face. She went inside. She washed her hands. She set the book on her nightstand and was asleep again before the lamp cooled. In the morning, she found that her name had been added to the enclosure roster in the headkeeper's handwriting. Under access level, someone had written simply, "Approved." She did not question it. She had work to do. The boy Kalen had been 11 years old when his father placed a wolf pup in his arms and told him that this creature would outlive most of what he loved, and that this was not a tragedy, but a fact, and that understanding the difference between those two things was the beginning of becoming a man. The pup had been small enough to hold in 2 cupped hands, silver white, eyes still clouded with that early, unfocused blue that slowly gave way, over weeks, to pale amber. Kalen had named him Lorne, without knowing why the name came to him so immediately and completely. It had simply been the right name, the way some things are simply right without explanation. That had been 34 years ago. Kalen Voss was 45 now, and he had been Alpha King for 16 of those years. He had taken the title at 29 following his father's death, and he had worn it with the particular kind of quiet that came not from ease, but from the daily decision to speak less than he knew and act more precisely than most people expected. He was not cold, he was careful. There was a difference, though he understood that from the outside, to most people, the two looked identical. He had stopped explaining the difference years ago. Lorne had died 3 winters past, on a night when the first snow of the season was just beginning to fall, and the sanctuary had gone very still in the way that places go still when something old and significant is leaving them. Kalen had been there. He had sat beside him until it was over. He had stayed for another 2 hours after, not because there was anything left to do, but because leaving felt like something that had to be decided, not simply done. He had not announced it. He had commissioned the preservation quietly, through the eldest pack shaman, a man named Valen, who had handled such things before, and who understood without being told that some losses were private, in a way that public acknowledgement would not honor but diminish. The rite was old, and it was not common. It kept the form intact, the fur soft, the posture natural. It was not intended as denial. It was intended as a bridge, a space between the moment of death and the moment when the living person standing at that edge was ready to cross it. Kalen had been standing at that edge for 3 years. He came to the enclosure every night. Always after midnight, when the staff had gone in and the grounds were empty, he came and he sat outside the gate, and he was quiet for however long felt right, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes more than an hour, and then he stood and walked back and did not speak of it to anyone, because there was no one he had chosen to speak of it to. He had not expected anyone to be inside. He had stood at the tree line and watched Mara leave through the gate, watched her walk back to the quarters, watched the light appear briefly in a staff room window and then go dark. He had stood there for a long time after, in a state that was not quite anger and not quite something else, and that he could not name precisely because he had not felt it before. Someone had been inside Lorne's enclosure. Someone had gone in without his knowledge, had sat on the floor beside the preserved body of his oldest companion, had spoken aloud into that silence. He had been close enough to hear the cadence of her voice through the mesh, though not the words, and had then fallen asleep. Fallen asleep. He had watched her go still, the book dropping slowly against her chest, her breathing going long and even. He had watched this for a moment he was not proud of, because the watching itself was a kind of intrusion, and he was aware of that. But he had not been able to look away immediately, because the sight of it was strange and specific in a way he had not prepared for. She had looked completely at peace, not the performance of peace, not the arranged stillness of someone aware of being watched. The real kind. The kind that only came to people who were not afraid of the space they were sitting in. She had looked, in that amber lantern light, like someone who had found exactly the right place to land. He had not gone inside. He had not woken her. He had stood outside the gate for some time, then turned and walked back to the main hall, which was what he did when he did not know what else to do. He was in his office at 6 in the morning when Gloria Hatch arrived with the daily enclosure log. She placed it on his desk without comment, the way she always did. She had worked for him for 11 years, and she had learned exactly which things required commentary and which ones should simply be placed on his desk in silence. He looked at the log. He saw Mara's name, listed under the far enclosure for the previous evening. He read the single line of notes she had filed. Wolf appeared calm and undisturbed. No behavioral concerns. Reading completed. He sat with that for a moment. She had filed a report. She had written it straight, as though it were an ordinary keeper's report about an ordinary resident. Wolf appeared calm and undisturbed. He thought about this. He thought about the way she had fallen asleep on the floor without apparent concern, the way she had left the gate exactly as she had found it, the way she had walked back to the quarters in the dark, without rushing, without looking over her shoulder. He picked up his pen. He wrote 2 words on a clean sheet of paper. He folded it once. He went down to the sanctuary before the morning shift arrived and placed the folded note inside the gate of the far enclosure, where she would find it when she came in the evening. Then he went back to his office, and he sat behind his desk, and he did not think about it again for the rest of the day. Or so he told himself. He thought about it 3 more times before noon, which was not something he acknowledged to himself until much later. Gloria knocked on his door at midday and asked, without looking at him directly, whether she should add the new keeper to the permanent far enclosure roster. He said yes without hesitating. She wrote it down and left. He looked out the window at the tree line, at the long shadow of the pines stretching across the frost-pale ground. He had not heard a human voice in that enclosure in 3 years. He did not know what to do with the fact that he had not found it unwelcome. It was the 3rd evening when Mara first understood that something was different about this place. Not wrong. Different. She had returned each night as she had been asked to, or instructed to, though asked felt more accurate given that the note inside the gate had said come back and not you are required to, or you will attend. It was a small distinction, but Mara paid attention to small distinctions. They were usually the ones that mattered. On the first night after finding the note, she had brought a new book. She had finished the folk tales and had chosen something longer, a collection of old nature essays by a writer she had read in school, the kind of writing that moved slowly and noticed everything. She had settled into the hay the way she might settle into a chair in a room she was beginning to feel at home in, without excessive ceremony, without looking at the door. Lorne lay in his usual position, still, pale, massive. She read for an hour and a half. She did not fall asleep, though she felt the pull of it in the last 20 minutes, and resisted it this time, because falling asleep once was forgivable, and falling asleep twice felt like a habit she had not decided to form yet. When she left, she refastened the gate and made a note in her log. On the 2nd evening, it rained. The mesh ceiling let the rain through in thin silver threads, and the sound of it on the wire and the hay was surprisingly pleasant. She pulled the collar of her jacket up and read a chapter about a man who had spent 40 years studying the migration patterns of a single river. She found it deeply interesting in the way that very specific knowledge always interested her, the idea that a person could give 40 years to one river and still feel, at the end, that they had not learned enough. She thought Lorne would appreciate that kind of story. She was not sure why she thought this. She thought it anyway. On the 3rd evening, she arrived to find a second lantern inside the enclosure. It had not been there before. It was placed a few feet to her left of her usual spot, positioned so that its light fell across the page of whatever book she was reading without throwing shadows. Someone had placed it there deliberately, at a precise angle, for exactly that purpose. She looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down, opened her book, and said nothing about it. She did not look toward the gate when she read. She did not check whether someone was watching. She read the way she always read. Carefully, steadily, without performance. But she was aware, in the peripheral way that the body sometimes knows things before the mind does, that she was not entirely alone. She read for 2 hours that evening. When she was done, she stood and stretched and looked at the lantern. She reached out and adjusted it slightly, a small turn that improved the angle by perhaps 5 degrees. She considered leaving a note. She decided against it. She walked back to the staff quarters through cool air that smelled of rain-damp pine. Inside, she found Gloria in the break room, making tea with the focused attention of someone who preferred tasks over conversation. Mara poured herself a cup of water and sat at the table. "How long has Lorne been here?" she asked. Gloria stirred her tea. "Long time. The records only have his name. No intake date." "Some of the old ones didn't get proper records," Gloria said. "He was here before the record system changed." Mara nodded. "Has he always been in that enclosure alone?" Gloria looked at the wall. "Yes? No pack companion? No rotation with other wolves?" "No." Mara waited, but nothing more came. She finished her water and went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about the lantern. Someone had gone into that enclosure and placed it precisely for her use. That meant someone had watched her read long enough to know exactly where the shadow fell across her page. That meant someone had been at the gate for more than a passing moment. She thought about who had access to the far enclosure. The roster listed only 3 names: Gloria Hatch, authorized maintenance, and a name above both of theirs that she had noticed but not said aloud: Kalen Voss. She had not yet seen the Alpha King. She knew he was in residence. His presence at Silver Ridge was not a secret, though his schedule was not posted anywhere she had found. She had heard him referenced twice by other keepers in the careful, lowered voice way that people reference someone who is not dangerous exactly, but who commands a particular quality of attention. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. She thought about the 2-word note. She thought about the gate left unlocked on her first night. She thought about a lantern placed at a precise angle for a reader. The lantern placer had clearly watched for some time. She thought, whoever this is, they are not careless. She thought, neither am I. She went to sleep. The following afternoon, she was doing routine health checks on the wolves in the eastern enclosures when she looked up and saw him. He was standing at the far end of the path, speaking with the pack veterinarian, a young man named Owen Garrett, who gestured frequently when he talked, and who had been kind to Mara in the uncomplicated way of people who were kind to everyone. The man beside Owen was not gesturing. He was standing in the way that certain people stand. Not stiffly, but with a particular quality of stillness, as though stillness were something he had chosen and not simply fallen into. He was taller than she had expected, though she had not expected anything specific, dark-haired, wearing plain, dark clothing without insignia or display of any kind, which struck her because most people in positions of significant authority found at least one way to signal it in how they dressed. He was listening to Owen with full attention, which she noticed because full attention was rarer than it should be. He turned slightly, and for a moment his gaze crossed the length of the path and landed, without apparent intention, on her. She looked back. She was not the kind of person who looked away first out of habit. She looked directly at him the way she looked at everything, with honest attention and without aggression. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, then he turned back to Owen without expression. She returned to the health check. Her hands were steady. Her notes were clear. She finished the row and moved on. But she understood now, with the certainty of someone connecting threads that had been in plain sight, who had placed the lantern inside the enclosure. And she understood something else too, something quieter and more careful, something that lived in the quality of his gaze across that distance. He was not angry that she was there. He was watching to see what she would do with the access she had been given. She filed her afternoon notes. She went to the break room. She chose her book for the evening. A different one this time, a longer one, a story she had been saving, and she did not hurry. She had not been given a reason to hurry. She had been given a second lantern, and 2 words, and a gate left unlocked on the first night. She ate dinner with the other keepers, and listened to their conversations, and did not contribute more than she needed to. She was not unfriendly. She simply understood that words were best used when they added something. At dusk, she gathered her book and her jacket. and walked the long path to the far enclosure. The second lantern was burning already. She pushed the gate open and walked inside. Lorne lay in the shadows, silver and still, his great head resting on his paws, his eyes closed. She sat down beside him in the hay and adjusted the nearer lantern by its handle, not because the angle needed correcting tonight, but because it was her space now, in some quiet, unofficial way, and she had the right to arrange it as she chose. She opened the book. She read. Behind her, beyond the mesh and the gate and the line of old pines, the night settled in around Silver Ridge, the way nights settled in at the edge of wild places, slowly, completely, without apology. And somewhere in the dark between the main hall and the tree line, a man stood still in the way that only a person carrying something heavy for a long time can stand still, and he listened to a voice reading aloud into an enclosure that had been silent for 3 years, and he did not move for a very long time. The shaman came on a Tuesday. Mara did not know she was a shaman until later. She first appeared simply as an old woman who walked with a cane made from a branch that had not been sanded or shaped, but used exactly as it had been found, and who wore a coat that had probably been dark green once and was now the color of things that have been outside in all weather for many years. She arrived at the sanctuary gate at mid-morning and was not stopped by anyone, which told Mara something. People who are stopped at gates are people who require permission. People who walk through gates without pausing are people who have had that permission for so long it no longer needs to be demonstrated. Mara was doing a feed check on the northern enclosures when she first noticed the old woman moving along the path with her branch cane, unhurried, looking at everything with the direct attention of someone who had been looking at things for a very long time and had not yet grown tired of it. Their eyes met briefly. The old woman nodded once, not in greeting exactly, but in the way of someone acknowledging that they see you, and that you, specifically, are who they came to see. Mara went back to her feed check. She finished the row and moved on to the afternoon log updates and did not go looking, because she had learned that things which were meant to find her had a way of doing so without being chased. The old woman found her at 4 in the afternoon, in the storage room off the main hall, where Mara was inventorying medication supplies. She knocked on the doorframe, which was not necessary since the door was open, but which Mara found she appreciated. "You're the new reader," the old woman said. "I suppose I am," Mara said. "My name is Vesa," the old woman said. "I've been connected to this sanctuary for a long time, longer than most people here." She said it without pride or weight, the way you might say you have lived in the same town for many years. Just a fact. Mara set down her clipboard. "Mara Ellison," she said. "I came from Halford." Vesa nodded, as though she already knew this. She looked around the storage room with the mild interest of someone revisiting a familiar place that has been rearranged slightly since their last visit. Then she looked back at Mara. "Would you walk with me?" she asked. They walked the outer path of the sanctuary, the one that ran along the fence line with the pines pressing close on the other side. Vesa moved slowly but steadily, her cane marking quiet rhythm on the packed earth. Mara adjusted her pace without thinking about it. She had always been good at walking at other people's speed. Vesa asked her about Halford, about the wolves she had worked with there, about how she had come to sanctuary work in the first place. Mara answered honestly and without embellishment. She had grown up near wild land. She had always found animals easier to understand than most situations and most people, not because animals were simple, but because they did not pretend to be things they were not. She had found a job at 18, helping with a small wildlife rehabilitation program, and she had never really stopped. Vesa listened the way people who have learned to really listen, without filling the pauses, without nodding eagerly to signal comprehension, just receiving what was said and holding it. When Mara finished, Vesa was quiet for a moment. They had reached the far end of the path, where it turned east and the fence curved toward the back of the property. The late afternoon light came through the pines in long, low bars. "The enclosure at the end of the row," Vesa said. "How does it feel to you when you're inside it?" Mara considered this honestly. "Quiet," she said, "but not empty. There's a difference." Vesa looked at her. "Yes," she said, "there is." They stood for a moment. "Lorne was Kalen's wolf," Vesa said. "From boyhood. They were together for more than 30 years. He was—" She paused, and in the pause, Mara felt the weight of what was coming, the specific gravity of words, arranged around a truth that was about to be stated plainly. He was not an ordinary wolf. Not in years, and not in what he carried for that family. Mara was still. He died 3 years ago, Vesa said. In the first snow of that winter. Kaelin was with him. The silence after this was complete. Mara did not speak. She was aware of many things at once, the quality of the light, the sound of the pines, the particular stillness of Vesa beside her, and the thing that was rearranging itself inside her understanding, quietly, firmly, like furniture being moved in a room she had thought she already knew. She had been reading to a body. She had been falling asleep beside a preserved body, in an enclosure that had been sealed and kept, and tended, by a man who had been carrying this grief in private for 3 years. She had been filing notes. Wolf appeared calm and undisturbed, reading completed, about a wolf who was no longer there in the way that mattered. The preservation, Mara said. It was not a question. She was simply saying aloud what she now understood. Valen's work, Vesa said. He has done it before in other cases. It is not a common right. It is for specific situations, for people who need time. 3 years is a long time, Mara said. Grief does not run on a schedule, Vesa said. Particularly the grief of people who have not allowed themselves to grieve properly in the first place. Mara turned this over. She thought about the gate left unlocked on her first night. She thought about the folded note with 2 words. She thought about the lantern placed at exactly the right angle. She thought about the way his gaze had crossed the path and landed on her. Measuring, steady, without apology. She thought about a man who came to this enclosure every night, alone, after midnight, and sat in silence outside the gate of a space holding what remained of 30-some years of constant companionship. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Vesa looked at the fence line. "Because you are the first person who has been inside that enclosure in 3 years, she said. "And because Kaelin let you in." She let that sit between them for a moment. "He did not have to add your name to the roster," Vesa continued. "He did not have to leave the gate unlocked. He did not have to place the lantern. He did none of these things, because anyone told him to. He did them because—" She paused again, and this pause was different from the other. It had the quality of someone choosing words with unusual care, because something in the way you were in that space did not feel like an intrusion to him. And for Kaelin Voss, that is not a small thing. Mara was quiet for a long time. The pines shifted in a light wind. The last of the afternoon light was going orange at the edges. He was watching that first night, Mara said. "Yes, he could have come in. He could have told me to leave. Yes, but he didn't." "No," Vesa said. "He did not." Mara looked at the far end of the enclosure row, just visible beyond the curve of the path. She could see the edge of the gate, the lantern above it. She thought about what it meant to carry something alone for 3 years. She thought about the particular loneliness of grief that has no public shape, that does not get announced or mourned with ceremony, that simply exists in the private life of the person holding it, like a stone carried in a coat pocket. Always there, always its exact weight, felt most clearly in the quiet moments. She thought about what she had said on her 3rd evening, before she left. She had spoken to Lorne as though to a companion, told him she would bring a longer book the following night, asked if he had preferred the rain or the dry evenings. She had said these things because it felt right to say them, not because she believed he was answering. But Kaelin had heard her say them. At whatever distance he had been standing that night, he had heard a woman speak to his wolf the way someone speaks to a friend. She thought about what that would feel like to overhear, if you had been the only one speaking to him in silence for 3 years. She turned back to Vesa. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Vesa nodded. "I told you because you deserve to know, and because the knowing will not change the fact of what you have already been doing, which has been—" She looked for the word. "Exactly right. In a way I don't think you planned." She turned and began walking back up the path toward the main hall. Mara stood for a moment longer, alone at the far end of the fence line, in the last slant of afternoon light. She was not angry. She did not feel deceived. She had been given access to a private space, and she had used it as she would have used any space, with care and steadiness and honesty. The fact that the space held more than she had understood did not change what she had brought to it. She looked at the far gate. She thought, he is in there every night, alone. And then, more quietly, he is not alone. Not exactly. anymore. She walked back to the main hall, and she was still and clear inside herself, in the way she was when she understood something that had been waiting to be understood. That evening, she went to the enclosure as usual. She sat in the hay. She opened her book. She read. Mara did not go to the enclosure with a plan. She had never been a person who constructed plans for emotional situations, partly because she did not trust plans in spaces where the most important things were unscripted, and partly because she had learned, over years of working with animals, that the surest way to ruin a moment of genuine connection was to decide in advance what it should look like. She went because she always went. She brought the same book she had been reading for the past week, a long one, 400 pages, a story about a woman who had mapped a river system over 20 years, and in doing so had mapped herself. She had 80 pages left, and she had been allowing herself only a chapter a night, not to stretch it out unnecessarily, but because it deserved to be finished slowly. She settled into the hay. She adjusted the nearer lantern by habit. She looked at Lorne for a moment, as she always did, the silver coat, the immense stillness, the quality of presence that had never lessened for her, even after Vessa's words. She had thought the knowing might change the way she felt inside the enclosure, might make it strange or sad, in a way that hadn't been there before. It had not made it strange. It had made it heavier, in the way that understanding something fully always adds weight. But heavy was not the same as wrong. She opened the book. She read the chapter she had planned to read. Then she set the book down. This was different from all the other evenings. She had never set the book down before finishing her allotted chapter. She sat for a moment with the closed book across her knees and looked at the space around her, the lantern light on the hay, the mesh ceiling, and the cold stars above it, the shadowed far wall where Lorne lay in his permanent rest. She began to speak. Not to him, exactly. Not in the way she sometimes addressed him in passing, a light comment about the evening weather, or a question about the story. This was different. This was the kind of speaking that needs a witness, a real one, or a present one, but that sometimes, in the absence of either, finds its way out into any willing silence. She talked about her brother Daniel, who was 4 years younger than her, and who had died at 23 of a sudden illness, so fast-moving that by the time she had arrived at the hospital, he was already beyond the point of conversation. She had sat with him for 14 hours, in a room that smelled of clean plastic and recycled air, reading aloud from the only book she had in her bag, a travel memoir about a man who crossed a desert alone, because she had not known what else to do, and because she had always believed, without being able to prove it, that the voice of someone who loved you reached you even when nothing else could. She talked about the house she had grown up in, which had been sold after her parents separated when she was 16, and which she had never gone back to see, because some places were better kept in the version that lived in memory than in the version that time and strangers had made of them since. She talked about Halford, about the wolves there, 3 of whom she had worked with from pup to old age, and whose deaths she had been present for, and had processed, she thought, reasonably well, until she arrived at Silver Ridge, and found an enclosure that smelled of something very old and specific, and found herself, without deciding to, being affected in a way that she had not anticipated. She talked for nearly an hour. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried easily, not because she did not feel things, but because she had a high threshold, and her feeling tended to go inward rather than outward. But her voice was quieter at the end than it had been at the beginning, and her hands were loose in her lap, and she felt, when she finally stopped, the particular lightness that comes after setting something down that has been carried for a while without acknowledgement. She sat for another few minutes. Then she stood, picked up her book, and said, in the direction of the silver still shape in the shadows, "I'm glad I found this place, whatever the reason." She let herself out through the gate. The night was cold and clear, the stars very sharp. She pulled her jacket closer and started up the path. He was standing at the edge of the path, not hidden, not at the tree line in shadow the way she imagined he usually placed himself. He was standing directly on the path, in the open, in the way of someone who had made a decision, and was standing in the result of it. His hands were in the pockets of his jacket. He was not blocking her way. He was simply there. Mara stopped. They looked at each other. She thought about what he had heard. She did not know how long he had been at the gate. Long enough, probably. Long enough to have heard about Daniel and the hospital room and the desert crossing memoir. Long enough to have heard about Halford and the wolves she had loved there and had tried to grieve properly. Long enough to have heard her say she was glad to have found this place. She looked at him directly. She always did. "I know," she said simply. She meant it as a statement about what she knew. About Lorne, about the 3 years, about the weight he had been carrying without a place to put it. She was not certain he would understand it that way, but she had found that when words were chosen with precision, they tended to land correctly. He was quiet for a long moment. The night air moved between them. "You know," he said. It was not quite a question. "Vesa told me," she said, 4 days ago. He did not react visibly. He absorbed this, the way he seemed to absorb everything, with a stillness that was not blankness, but that was the quality of someone who processes quickly and quietly, and does not perform the processing. "And you came back," he said. "Yes," she said. "Every night." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Why?" It was a real question. She could hear that. Not rhetorical, not defensive. He genuinely wanted to know, with the same honesty she had heard in his voice the first morning when he had asked her if Lorne seemed at peace. She thought about how to answer it honestly. "Because the enclosure is still what it is," she said. "Knowing the details doesn't change the fact of the place. And the place," she paused, finding the right word, "the place is real. What it holds is real. That doesn't stop being true because the circumstances are different from what I first thought." He was quiet. She continued, "I've sat with dying wolves before. I've sat with wolves after death. The relationship between a person and an animal they love, it doesn't end at the point anyone would call an ending. You know that. You have always known that. That's why the enclosure is still the way it is." He looked away from her, just briefly, in the direction of the far gate. The lantern above it was visible from here, a small amber point in the dark. "I never said it," he said. She waited. "Publicly," he said, "to the pack. I never announced it. Lorne was known. He was part of things for a long time. People noticed when he was no longer present in the way he had been. But I said he was aging, that he was being given privacy in his final months." Mara understood what he was telling her. He had protected the grief by making it invisible. And in making it invisible, he had also made himself invisible inside it, without witnesses, without support, without anyone to say the thing aloud to. People would have understood, she said, not as a judgment, as a statement of fact she thought he deserved to hear. "I know," he said. "I couldn't let them." She thought about this for a moment. She thought about what Vesa had said, the grief of people who have not allowed themselves to grieve properly in the first place. She thought about a man who came to an enclosure every night in secret to be near the preserved body of his oldest companion because that was the only form the grief had been given. "What was his name?" she asked. "When you were a boy, did you name him right away?" He looked back at her. She thought she saw something shift in his expression, something small and precise, the way ice shifts just before it begins to give. "Yes," he said, immediately, before I was told if it was a good name or not. "What did you call him in your head, when you were just talking to him, not for anyone else?" A pause. "The same thing," he said. "Always just Lorne." She nodded. They stood in the cold, clear night. The stars were very bright. Somewhere in the pines, something small and nocturnal moved and then went still. She said, "My name is Mara. You've probably read it on the roster, but I think you should know it from me." Something that was almost, a change in expression, a thing that lived at the very edge of what his face was willing to show. "I know," he said. "Gloria told me when she added you." "And you are Kalen," she said. "Yes, not Alpha King. A beat, that too. Right now, you're Kalen," she said. It was not a question, and it was not a challenge. It was an offering of something specific, of a space in which the title didn't apply, the same way the enclosure was a space in which ordinary sanctuary rules had not applied from the first night. He looked at her for a long moment. "Right now, I am Kalen," he agreed. They stood for another moment in the dark. "I'm going to finish my book tomorrow night," she said. "Last 80 pages. I've been going slowly." "What happens?" he said. She blinked slightly. In the book? Yes. She looked at the far gate and its small amber light. She finishes the map, she said. 20 years of work, and she realizes, when she's done, that what she made was not just a map of the river, it was a record of every single thing she learned to pay attention to along the way. He was quiet. She thought he was thinking about this. She thought he was thinking about something else too. Beneath it, the way people think about two things at once when one of them is too large to approach directly. I'll be there, he said. She looked at him. Not outside the gate, he said. If that, he paused, and she understood that he was asking something he did not quite have the practice of asking. If that's all right. Yes, she said. That's all right. She walked the rest of the path to the staff quarters. She did not look back. She did not need to. She could hear his footsteps on the packed earth, going the other direction, toward the main hall, unhurried, steady. Inside, she washed her hands, set the book on her nightstand, and lay down in the dark. She thought about a lantern placed at a precise angle. She thought about 2 words on a folded piece of paper. She thought about the specific kind of person who shows love through precise, careful action rather than declaration, who adjusts the light for you without being asked and considers the gesture complete. She thought, tomorrow he will come inside. She thought, I will read the last 80 pages. She thought, whatever comes after that will not be nothing. The last 80 pages took 3 hours. Mara had not intended for them to take that long. She had read steadily, at her usual pace, without rushing or dragging. But the book itself expanded in the final section, not in length but in weight. The woman in the story stood at the end of her 20-year river, holding the finished map, and the writing slowed deliberately around her, the way the writing of a good book always knows when to slow down, and when to move, and never confuses the two. Kalen sat 4 feet to Mara's right, his back against the wall of the enclosure, his knees drawn up, his jacket collar turned against the cold. He had arrived before she had, which she discovered when she pushed the gate open and found him already inside, sitting in the hay, the second lantern adjusted to the angle she had taught him without meaning to. He did not speak when she came in. She did not speak either. She sat down, opened the book, and began to read from where she had stopped the night before. He was a quiet person by nature. She had understood this from the beginning. But his quiet inside the enclosure was different from his quiet on the path the previous night. Less careful, less arranged. In here, the quality of his stillness was the kind that belongs to a person who has finally arrived somewhere after a long journey and is not yet ready to speak about the journey, but is aware, in the body, of having stopped moving. She read. Lorne lay in the far shadows, silver and permanent, his presence filling the space the way it always did. Not with warmth, not with the particular breathing, living pressure of an animal nearby, but with something she did not have a precise word for. Gravity, perhaps. The accumulated weight of what that space had held and continued to hold. When she reached the last page, she slowed further. She read each sentence to its proper end before beginning the next. She did not look up. She could feel, without looking, that Kalen had gone very still beside her. Stiller than his usual stillness, which was already considerable. She did not know what the book meant to him independently, if anything, but she knew that what was happening in this enclosure was not only about the book, and she thought he knew it too. She read the final paragraph. She read the final sentence. She read the period at its end. She closed the book. The silence was complete and gentle and had no edges. After a while, Kalen said, she finished the map. Yes, Mara said. And she understood that it was something else. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. What was the river's name? She smiled slightly, looking at the closed cover. She never names it in the book. There is a note at the end, explaining that the real river exists, and that she chose not to name it, to protect its particular character. She says, naming a thing, sometimes, is a way of claiming it, and she did not want to claim it. She only wanted to record it. He seemed to think about this. She wanted to be a witness, he said, not an owner. Yes, Mara said, exactly that. They sat in the silence that followed this. After several minutes, Kalen moved. He did not stand. He shifted slightly so that he was no longer leaning quite so far back against the wall, so that he was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his eyes forward, toward the far wall where Lorne lay. His hands were loosely clasped. He looked at the silver shape in the shadows for a long time. "He would have liked you," he said. He said it simply, without ceremony, the way a person states a fact they have thought about enough to be certain of. Mara looked at Lorne. What was he like? Stubborn, Kaelin said. Extremely. He had opinions about things, and he expressed them clearly. He did not respond well to being asked to do something he had already decided against. He was... A small pause. He was funny, in the way that animals are funny when they have a personality that is fully their own and entirely unapologetic about it. Mara smiled. What did he decide against? Rain, Kaelin said. He found rain personally offensive. He would sit at the edge of cover and look at it the way you look at something that is making your life unnecessarily difficult. She laughed quietly. It was the first time she had laughed inside the enclosure, and the sound surprised her slightly. He sounds like someone I would have liked too, she said. Kaelin looked at Lorne for another long moment. He was with me, he said, for things I have not talked about with anyone else. My father's death, the first year of the title, which was, he stopped, reorganized. He was with me through all of it. He did not understand it in the way a person would, but he was present in the way that presence, sometimes, is the only thing that matters. Mara nodded. She understood this completely. She had believed it for years, and she had seen the proof of it more times than she could count. In hospital rooms, in sanctuaries, in the ordinary daily life of people who worked alongside animals. Presence was not a lesser thing than comprehension. In some situations, it was the superior thing. When he died, she said carefully, were you with him? Yes, Kaelin said. From the morning. He went in the evening. In the first snow, she said. He looked at her. Vesa told you that. Yes. He looked back at Lorne. There was something fitting about it, he said. He always disliked rain, but the first snow, he responded to it differently. He would come out from cover and sit in it. He searched for the right word. He seemed to consider it worth sitting in. She looked at Lorne's silver coat and thought about it catching snowflakes. She thought about a man sitting beside a wolf in falling snow, in the last evening of that life, and she thought about what it meant to be present for an ending that you had known was coming and that had still arrived before you were ready. Nothing arrives when you are ready. She had learned this many times, but knowing it and experiencing it were different subjects. You kept coming, she said. After. I couldn't stop, he said. It was the most direct thing he had said, and she heard the simplicity of it. Not an explanation or a justification, just the truth of it, stated plainly. I knew it was not rational, perhaps. I knew Valen's work was preservation and not continuation. I was not confused about what I was sitting outside, but sitting outside it was. He paused. It was the only place where the weight felt slightly different, not less, different. Mara understood this too. Grief is directional, she said. It needs somewhere to go. If you take away all the places it's allowed to go, it doesn't disappear, it just builds pressure. He looked at her. She thought he was considering whether she was right. She thought he was deciding that she was. You lost someone, he said. What you spoke about last night, your brother? She had known he had heard. She had expected him to acknowledge it at some point, or not acknowledge it, and had been prepared for either. Daniel, she said. Yes? I'm sorry, he said. She received this the way it was given, simply, without deflection, without performing composure or performing grief. Thank you, she said. They sat quietly. The night was cold, but the enclosure was warmer than outside, as it always was. The lanterns threw their steady amber light. Lorne lay unchanged in his shadows. Mara thought about the river mapping woman in the finished book, standing at the end of 20 years with a map in her hands that was also a record of attention. She thought about how the woman had not named the river and had not wanted to own it, had only wanted to witness it. She thought about what it meant to spend 20 years paying close attention to one thing, and what you became by the end of that, and whether the map was the point, or the paying attention was the point, and the map was simply what you had to show for it. She thought about Kaelin, who had paid attention to Lorne for 34 years, who had learned the shape of a relationship that had no public language for its depth, that did not have ceremonies assigned to it the way the loss of a person had ceremonies assigned, and who had arrived at the end of it without any map at all, and had built himself a private vigil instead. She thought, he needed a witness. He has needed one for 3 years, not for the grief to be performed for, but for it to simply be seen. She looked at him. He was looking at Lorne. I think, she said carefully, that the reason you let me in was not entirely about Lorne. He did not answer immediately. This was not avoidance. He was thinking about whether she was right. She had observed that this was how he processed things, genuinely, without rushing to a conclusion, with the seriousness of a person who considered accuracy a form of respect. No, he said finally, not entirely. She nodded. You were unafraid, he said. That first night, in the enclosure, you sat down and read without, he searched for it, without reading the situation first, without performing caution or curiosity. You just sat down and opened the book. It's what I was asked to do, she said. Most people read the situation, he said. That enclosure makes people read the situation. There is something about it that registers as significant, even for people who do not know why. I noticed the significance, she said. I just decided to do the work anyway. He looked at her. That, he said, is the thing that made me come to the gate. The lantern between them moved slightly in a draft from the mesh ceiling, and then settled. The light was steady and amber and warm. Mara reached into the side pocket of her jacket and drew out another book. She had brought it tonight, without being certain she would need it, but she had brought it because she had a feeling, and she had learned to follow her feelings in the quiet moments. It was small, cloth-covered, dark blue. She held it out to him. He looked at it. He took it from her hand with careful fingers. He turned it over. What is this? A book of elegies, she said. Poems for the dead. I brought it from Halford. It was given to me when Daniel died, by a woman who had known a great deal of loss, and who told me that language for grief was one of the oldest things humans had ever made, and that reading it aloud was better than reading it silently. He held the book. I have not read it in 2 years, she said. I think you should have it. He looked at it for a long moment. She could not read his expression precisely, but she had the sense of watching someone hold something that was simultaneously ordinary and very heavy. You don't have to read from it here, she said. That's not what I mean. I mean, it's yours, for whatever use it is, whenever. He nodded once. He did not give it back. They sat in the enclosure for another hour, not reading, not speaking much, just present, in the way that two people are present together when they have both decided, without announcement, that the presence is what matters, and that it requires nothing added to it. When Mara finally rose to go, he rose with her. They walked together to the gate. She let herself out first and he followed, and he latched the gate behind him with the same care she always used. They walked up the path together. Not side by side exactly, but close enough. The night was cold and the stars were extraordinary. At the point where the path split, one direction toward the staff quarters, one toward the main hall, they stopped. The shaman, Kaelin said. Valen. I've been, he has asked, several times, if I am ready for the release rite, the formal one, for Lorne. She looked at him. I think, he said slowly, that I may be closer to ready than I was. She nodded. Will you be there? He asked. It was the same question he had asked the night before, in different words, about the enclosure. Yes, she said, if you want me there. I want you there, he said, without hesitation, which she thought cost him something, and which she received accordingly. She said good night. He said good night. They walked in opposite directions. Inside, she set the finished book on her nightstand and lay down in the dark and thought about 20 years and a river and the difference between witnessing and owning. She thought about a man who had been alone with something enormous for 3 years and who had, without planning it, let someone in through a gate that had been locked to everyone else. She thought about the blue cloth-covered book in his hands and hoped it would be useful to him. She thought about the release rite and the full moon it would require, and the two of them standing together in the cold while something long held was finally given its proper name and its proper goodbye. She was asleep before any of these thoughts resolved into conclusions, which was fine. Not everything needed to resolve at night. Some things were better left to continue in the morning, and the morning after that, and the long chain of mornings that is what a life, any life, is made of. Outside, somewhere between the main hall and the tree line, a man sat at a window in the dark with a small blue book in his hands. He did not open it yet, he simply held it. Above the sanctuary, the stars were very bright, and the night was long and quiet, and the lantern above the far gate burned its steady amber until dawn came and replaced it with something larger and less precise and altogether more necessary. 3 months later, on the night of the full moon in the first month of winter, the release rite was performed. Valen, who was very old and who moved with the economy of someone who had long since stopped spending energy on anything unnecessary, stood at the entrance to the enclosure and spoke in the old language for 17 minutes. Mara stood to Kalen's right. She did not hold his hand. She stood close enough that their arms touched through their jackets, which was its own kind of holding. When it was over, the preservation dissolved slowly into the silver coat, the form settling by quiet degrees into the earth and the cold, the way all things settle eventually. The enclosure lantern burned without interruption. Kalen was still for a long time. Then he said, quietly, not to anyone in particular, "Goodbye, Lorne." It was the simplest possible version of what needed to be said, which was why it was the right version. Mara stood beside him until he was ready to leave. She did not time it. She did not look at him repeatedly to gauge his state. She simply stood, in the way she had learned to stand in that enclosure over months of evenings, present, steady, without requiring anything of the moment, except that it be itself. When he finally moved, she moved with him. They walked out through the gate, which he latched behind them for the last time. They walked up the path together under the full moon and the brilliant winter stars. Their breath made small clouds in the cold air. The pines were very dark against the sky. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They walked the full length of the outer path, past the eastern enclosures, past the storage rooms, past the break room window where a light was on and someone was making late tea. They walked without destination, which was its own kind of direction. At the point where the path curved back toward the main hall, Kalen stopped. He looked up at the moon for a moment. "He sat in the first snow," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me." Every winter after that, he remembered. He would go to the edge of cover on the first snow day and wait for it. She looked up at the moon with him. "He had good instincts," she said. "Yes," Kalen said, "he always did." The winter air settled around them. Somewhere beyond the fence, something moved briefly in the dark pines and went still. Mara said, "Next winter, when the first snow comes." He looked at her. "We should be outside when it starts," she said. "Both of us." He was quiet for a moment. She thought about what she had offered. Not a plan exactly, and not a declaration exactly, but something that lived in the space between the two, which was where the most honest things tended to live. "Yes," he said. It was a simple word, but in his voice, given the company it kept, 3 years of private grief, a gate left unlocked, a lantern placed at a precise angle, a blue book received with careful hands, the formal goodbye of a full moon night, it carried everything that had led to it. They walked back to the main hall together. He held the door. She went in first. The warmth of the building closed around them both. Whatever came next would not be nothing. They had already made sure of that. One evening at a time, in a space between a lantern and a silver coat, and the quiet, necessary work of paying attention to what was actually there. She had fallen asleep in that enclosure without knowing what it held. She had woken, and learned, and come back every evening anyway. That, she thought, was the whole of the story, and also the beginning of a different one.